The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Henderson Estate Sales in Hartford, Connecticut, as appraiser Margaret Chen carefully examined the contents of the Whitmore family attic. The elderly homeowner, Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, had passed away at 93, leaving behind a century of accumulated memories in boxes and frames. Most of these photographs are fairly standard for the era, Margaret murmured, sorting through sepia-toned family portraits. The musty smell of old paper and forgotten time filled her nostrils as she worked by lamplight in the cramped space. Then she found it. A formal studio portrait from 1908, professionally mounted in an ornate silver frame. The photograph showed a well-dressed family of 4, a stern-looking father in a dark suit, a woman in an elaborate white dress with intricate lacework, and 2 young children, a boy and a girl, positioned between their parents. The studio's name was embossed in gold lettering at the bottom, Hartwell and Sons Photography. Hartford, Connecticut. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical Edwardian family portrait, the kind found in countless American homes from that prosperous era. The father stood with one hand on his son's shoulder. The mother's hands rested gently on her daughter's arms, and all 4 family members wore the serious expressions common in photographs of the time. But something about the father's eyes made Margaret pause. She held the photograph closer to the lamp, squinting at the man's face. His eyes held an intensity that seemed cold and calculating, not the warm authority of a loving patriarch, but something predatory and unsettling. The way shadows fell across his face emphasized the hardness in his expression, and there was something in his gaze that made her skin crawl. Most unsettling was how the children seemed to shrink away from him, their small bodies angled slightly away from their father's imposing presence. Margaret shook her head, attributing the feeling to the poor lighting in her imagination after a long day. 3 days later, back in her downtown Hartford office, Margaret couldn't shake her unease about the photograph. She'd appraised thousands of vintage family portraits over her 15-year career, but this one lingered in her mind like an unresolved nightmare. Using her high-resolution scanner and digital magnification software, she examined the image more closely. The studio work was exceptional for 1908. Sharp focus, excellent composition, and remarkable detail that revealed more than she had initially noticed. As she zoomed in on the family members, disturbing details emerged. The children's faces showed subtle signs of distress. The young boy's smile was forced, his eyes wide with what looked like barely contained fear. The little girl's hands were clenched into small fists at her sides, and Margaret could make out what appeared to be marks on the child's upper arm, partially hidden by her dress sleeve. The mother's expression was even more telling. While she maintained the stoic pose expected of the era, her eyes held a haunted quality. There were dark circles beneath them, and her mouth was set in a tight line that spoke of endured hardship rather than natural seriousness. But it was the father who commanded attention. His eyes weren't just cold, they were calculating, controlling. The way he gripped his son's shoulder showed tension that suggested more pressure than a gentle paternal touch. His other hand, Margaret noticed with growing concern, was positioned in a way that seemed both protective and threatening. She printed the enhanced image and studied it under her desk magnifier. This wasn't a happy family portrait. It was documentation of a household living in fear. Margaret reached for her phone. She needed to learn more about this family and what had happened to them after this photograph was taken. Dr. James Morrison at Hartford University specialized in local genealogy and historical records. When Margaret brought him the photograph, his expression grew somber as he studied the family's faces. The clothing and studio setting suggest a wealthy family, he observed, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. The father's suit is expensive, probably custom-tailored. The mother's dress shows significant investment in appearance. This was a family of considerable means. Margaret pointed out the troubling details she discovered in the enhanced images, the children's fearful expressions, the mother's haunted look, the apparent marks on the little girl's arm. Dr. Morrison's face darkened as he examined these elements more closely. You're right to be concerned. These signs, they tell a story that goes far beyond a simple family portrait. Using the Hartford Historical Society's archives, they began searching for records from 1908. The studio's name provided their first lead, Hartwell and Sons. Photography had kept detailed client records, many of which survived in the Historical Society's collection. Here we are, Dr. Morrison said, pulling out a leather-bound appointment book. October 15th, 1908. The Harrison family, Charles Harrison, prominent businessman, wife Catherine, children Thomas and Mary, ages 8 and 6, respectively. The appointment notes included additional details. Family portrait requested by Mr. Harrison for business purposes. Payment in advance, gold coin. Requested multiple copies for distribution. Business purposes? Margaret questioned. Dr. Morrison continued reading. Mr. Harrison specifically requested that the portrait project, an image of prosperity and family stability. He emphasized the importance of the children appearing well-behaved and content. The phrasing sent a chill through Margaret. Who needed to prove their children were content unless there was reason to believe otherwise? Charles Harrison's name appeared frequently in Hartford's business records from 1905 to 1908. He owned Harrison Manufacturing, a company that produced farm equipment and employed over 200 workers. On the surface, he appeared to be a pillar of the community, wealthy, influential, and respected among Hartford's business elite. But Dr. Morrison discovered troubling patterns in the newspaper archives. "Look at this," he said, spreading out several Hartford Current clippings on the library table. Between 1906 and 1908, there were multiple reports of workplace incidents at Harrison Manufacturing. Workers injured in machinery accidents, unsafe working conditions, complaints about impossible quotas. Margaret read over his shoulder. The reports painted a picture of a man who valued profit over human life. Workers described Charles Harrison as harsh and demanding, someone who showed no compassion for injuries or family emergencies. "Here's something more concerning," Dr. Morrison continued, pointing to a smaller article. 3 different workers' families reported that their teenage daughters had gone missing after Charles Harrison offered them employment at his residence as household staff. The families claimed the girls were never seen again. Margaret's stomach turned. "What happened to the investigations?" That's the problem," Dr. Morrison replied grimly. "Each investigation was mysteriously discontinued after a few weeks. Harrison had significant influence with local law enforcement and city officials. Money has a way of silencing inconvenient questions. They found more disturbing evidence in the city's medical records. Dr. Morrison had connections at Hartford Hospital's historical archives, and what they discovered there painted an even darker picture. Dr. William Patterson, the city's primary physician in 1908, kept detailed notes about his patients," Dr. Morrison explained. "He treated Catherine Harrison multiple times for injuries sustained in household incidents, broken ribs, facial injuries, arm fractures. The pattern suggests systematic mistreatment." Margaret thought about the haunted expression in Catherine Harrison's eyes in the photograph. "And the children?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dr. Patterson's medical records revealed the true nature of life in the Harrison household. Both children had been treated for injuries that the doctor privately noted as inconsistent with accidental causes. Young Thomas had suffered a broken arm that showed signs of being deliberately twisted, and little Mary had been treated for severe burns on her hands that Dr. Patterson suspected were inflicted as punishment. "The doctor was clearly documenting evidence," Dr. Morrison said, his voice heavy with disgust. "Look at these notes. He wrote them in a kind of code, probably to protect himself if Harrison ever saw the records. The coded entries, when deciphered, told a story of systematic household tyranny. Charles Harrison used intimidation as a tool of control, not just against his workers, but against his own family. The medical records suggested that both children lived in constant fear of their father's unpredictable moods." Margaret studied the photograph again with this new knowledge. The forced smile on Thomas's face, the clenched fists of little Mary, the way both children seemed to be trying to make themselves smaller. It all made terrible sense now. Dr. Patterson also made notes about Catherine Harrison's mental state, Dr. Morrison continued. He believed she was suffering from what we would now recognize as severe depression and anxiety. She had asked him about remedies for helping children sleep through disturbances, and had inquired about medical justifications for extended visits to relatives. She was trying to find ways to protect the children, Margaret realized. "It appears so. But there's more." Dr. Morrison pulled out another document. In November 1908, just 1 month after this photograph was taken, Dr. Patterson was asked to examine the remains of 2 young women found in the Connecticut River. Both had been in the water for several weeks, but he noted that one of them matched the description of a missing girl whose family had accused Charles Harrison of taking her. Margaret felt sick. Did he report this to authorities? He tried. But within days of making his report, Dr. Patterson received threats. His medical practice was vandalized, and he was told to mind his own business or face consequences. The investigation into the deceased girls was quickly closed, ruled as accidental drownings. The photograph now seemed like evidence of something far more sinister than a typical family portrait. The Harrison family's story took its most crucial turn in the winter of 1908. Margaret and Dr. Morrison discovered that just 3 months after the family portrait was taken, the entire Harrison household had vanished without explanation. According to property records, the Harrison mansion was abandoned in January 1909, Dr. Morrison explained, reading from city documents. Servants reported that the family simply disappeared overnight. Meals were left half-eaten on the table, clothes remained in wardrobes, and valuable items were left behind. The servants' testimonies, recorded by the property manager, painted a picture of the family's final days that suggested careful planning rather than sudden departure. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Bridget O'Malley, reported that Catherine Harrison had seemed increasingly determined in the weeks before the disappearance. Mrs. O'Malley said Catherine had been secretly preparing small bags and hiding them around the house. Margaret read from the testimonies. She also noticed that Catherine had been giving away jewelry and family heirlooms to the servants, saying they were early Christmas gifts. The groundskeeper, Thomas Murphy, had observed Charles Harrison behaving strangely as well. Mr. Harrison had been burning papers in the backyard for weeks, Murphy reported. Large amounts of documents, working late into the night by the fire. He also dismissed most of the staff without explanation, keeping only the most loyal employees. Most telling was the testimony of the children's governess, Miss Emily Carter. She reported that both Thomas and Mary had been having severe nightmares and had begged her not to leave them alone with their father. The night before they disappeared, Miss Carter's statement read, "I heard raised voices from the master bedroom, followed by what sounded like furniture being overturned. When I checked on the children the next morning, their beds hadn't been slept in and the family was gone. What do you think happened?" Margaret asked. Dr. Morrison's expression was hopeful. "I think Catherine Harrison finally found the courage to take her children and run." The search for the missing Harrison family had been surprisingly brief and ineffective. Police records from 1909 showed that while a missing persons report was filed, the investigation was perfunctory at best. The detective assigned to the case was James O'Brien, Dr. Morrison discovered. His reports are suspiciously minimal, just a few interviews with neighbors and servants, no follow-up on potential leads, no coordination with police in other cities. Margaret found this strange. For a family as prominent as the Harrisons, wouldn't there have been more pressure to find them? "That's what I would have expected," Dr. Morrison agreed. "But look at this. Within a month of the family's disappearance, Detective O'Brien purchased a new house in a much more expensive neighborhood. His sudden wealth coincided perfectly with the end of his investigation into the Harrisons. They found more evidence of corruption in the Hartford City Council records. Charles Harrison had made substantial donations to several city officials' campaigns, and there were documented instances of him using his financial influence to avoid consequences for safety violations at his factory. I think Charles Harrison had enough people in his pocket that when his family disappeared, he was able to ensure the search was called off quickly." Dr. Morrison concluded Margaret discovered another crucial piece of evidence in the Connecticut State Archives, Railroad. Passenger manifests from January 1909, while most records from that period were incomplete. She found what appeared to be documentation of 3 passengers traveling under assumed names, a woman and 2 children who boarded a train in New Haven bound for Boston on January 15, 1909. Catherine Harrison, Thomas, and Mary, she read the assumed names aloud. Catherine Miller, Thomas Miller, and Mary Miller. The ages matched the Harrison children exactly. "So they made it out," Dr. Morrison said with relief. "But what happened to Charles?" That question would prove much more difficult to answer. Charles Harrison seemed to have vanished completely after his family's escape, leaving behind only his empty mansion and his terrible legacy. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a diary hidden in the walls of the Harrison mansion during its demolition in 1962. The diary belonged to Catherine Harrison and had been discovered by a construction worker who kept it for decades before donating it to the Hartford Historical Society. Dr. Morrison obtained permission to examine the diary, and its contents revealed the full extent of life with Charles Harrison. Catherine's entries, written in a shaking hand over the course of 1908, documented systematic household tyranny that went far beyond what the medical records had suggested. Charles Harrison was not just harsh, he was cruel, taking pleasure in the fear and suffering of his family. October 10th, 1908, Dr. Morrison read aloud from one entry. Charles discovered that Mary had hidden a piece of bread from dinner to feed the stray cat in the garden. His punishment was severe. "I can no longer pretend that this will improve. The children deserve a life without terror." Another entry, dated just days before the family portrait. Charles insists we have the family photograph taken. He says it will help his business relationships to show what a stable, successful family looks like. The irony is sickening. He threatened both children with harsh consequences if they don't smile convincingly for the camera. The diary revealed that Catherine had been planning their escape for months, secretly saving money and arranging for help from her sister in Boston. But most chilling were the entries about Charles' escalating behavior toward others. November 20th, 1908, Catherine wrote. "Another young woman has gone missing, Sarah McKenna, barely 17. Her family came to our door, asking if Charles had offered her work. I wanted to warn them, but Charles was standing right behind me. God forgive me for my silence." The diary's final entries describe Catherine's desperate plan to fake their deaths in order to escape Charles permanently. December 30th, 1908. "We will leave tonight. I have told the children we are going on a wonderful adventure to see their aunt. I pray Charles believes we perished in the river. It is the only way we can truly be free." Margaret felt a chill reading these words, understanding finally why the family had vanished so completely. Catherine Harrison's plan to escape with her children was both desperate and brilliant. Using contacts from her previous life before marriage, she had arranged for safe passage to Boston and new identities for herself and the children. The diary revealed the full scope of her preparation. For months, she had been secretly corresponding with women's aid societies in Boston, progressive organizations that helped women escape difficult marriages. These groups, while operating quietly due to social attitudes of the time, had developed networks for protecting women and children from harmful situations. January 10th, 1909, read one of Catherine's final entries. Mrs. Elizabeth Morgan from the Boston Women's Protective League has confirmed our arrangement. She has a safe house where we can stay while we establish our new lives. The children will be able to attend school under their new names, and I will work as a seamstress to support us. Dr. Morrison had tracked down records from the Boston Women's Protective League, which had kept detailed but coded records of the women they helped. The Miller family had indeed been provided assistance in early 1909, and the records showed they had successfully integrated into Boston society. Catherine Miller worked for several Boston families as a seamstress and dressmaker, Dr. Morrison discovered. She was described as quiet but skilled, and her children were noted as being remarkably well-behaved and studious. Margaret felt a sense of relief knowing that Catherine and her children had found safety. The questions remained about Charles Harrison's fate. The answer came from police records in Springfield, Massachusetts. In March 1909, a man matching Charles Harrison's description had been found deceased in a boarding house, apparently from alcohol poisoning. He had been living under an assumed name and had told other residents that his family had perished in a tragic accident. The Springfield police report describes a man consumed with rage and alcohol, Dr. Morrison read. Other boarders reported that he would drink heavily and rant about ungrateful family members and disloyal workers. He died alone, and no one claimed his body. The photograph that had started their investigation now told a different story, not just of a family living in fear, but of a woman who found the courage to save herself and her children from a dangerous situation. 6 months after discovering the photograph in Mrs. Whitmore's attic, Margaret stood in the Hartford History Center next to a new exhibit titled Courage in Silence, Hidden Stories of Family Survival. The 1908 Harrison family portrait was now displayed alongside Catherine's diary excerpts, historical context about women's rights in early 20th century America. The exhibit had attracted attention from historians, social workers, and descendants of families who had lived through similar experiences. Dr. Morrison had worked with local women's advocacy groups to create educational materials that used the Harrison story to illustrate both the historical reality of household tyranny and the courage required to escape it. Catherine Harrison's story reminds us that behind every formal family portrait, there may be hidden struggles that we can't see. Dr. Morrison explained to a group of visitors. Her diary serves as testimony to the strength it took for women to protect their children in an era when they had few legal rights and limited options for escape. Margaret had successfully traced the Miller family through Boston records. Thomas Miller had grown up to become a teacher, dedicating his life to protecting children. Mary Miller had become a nurse, working with vulnerable populations. Both had lived full, productive lives far from the shadow of their father's cruelty. Most remarkably, Margaret had located their descendants. Catherine's great-granddaughter, Susan Miller Williams, had traveled from Boston to see the exhibit and learn about her family's hidden history. My great-grandmother rarely spoke about her first husband, Susan explained to Margaret. She always said that some stories were better left buried, but knowing what she overcame to save her children, it makes me incredibly proud of her courage. The photograph now rested in a place of honor, no longer a mysterious family portrait, but a testament to a mother's love and determination. The father's cold, predatory eyes served as a reminder of the evil that Catherine Harrison had fought against and ultimately defeated. Visitors often paused longest at Catherine's diary entries, reading her words of fear transformed into words of hope and action. The exhibit had become a powerful reminder that survival and escape are acts of heroism, and that sometimes the greatest courage is found not in grand gestures, but in the quiet determination to protect those we love.